He needs to reset. He has an opportunity here. He did defeat Magnus in this time patrol 2 years ago.
It's going to be hard to surmount the entire 4-point lead in the segment. But as I always say, when you're down big going into a segment, you got to try to have it. At least bring it down to 2. At least make it so that you can come back in the first half of the bullet. But whatever you do, don't let this match get away from you in the first couple of games. And that's precisely what Magnus Carlsen is going to try to do. Robert, he's going to try to bring the hammer down in these first 20 minutes or so.
Well, look at this opening. C4 from Maxime. He's changing up his opening play. He doesn't want to just be a target that Magnus has successfully been parrying off. So he plays this opening. We see a fianchetto bishop on both diagonals for white. The bishop on b2 staring down to e5 pawn, which is well defended. The bishop on g2, that's the powerhouse piece, right, Danya? In these English lines, the bishop has the length of the diagonal at its disposal.
Yeah, both bishops are kind of powerhouses. And the bishop on g2, there's a lot of traffic on the other diagonal right now. But eventually the knight can move away from f3. And if the knight on c6 is eliminated, maybe with an exchange sacrifice, then we're singing a completely different tune. A very alert response by Magnus. Rook takes c6, Robert, was actually a huge threat there.
It's so easy to overlook that as well because you think everything is nice and tidy. But f6, creating a pawn chain, e5 is well defended. And sometimes black plays the move knight to d4, and we may very well see that to open up the e-file, because if knight d4, e takes, the e2 pawn is a backwards pawn. But for now, Magnus Carlsen is parrying off the initial threats. He didn't allow b4. He plays queen d7 to prevent any sort of exchange sack on c6, at least for the time being. But there still may be one done. Rook takes c6
absolutely.
Is not always out of the question.
And it's a super common idea in the Sicilian. What we're talking about here is essentially a reverse Sicilian. That's what the English opening is. So a sacrifice on c6 has to be considered on every move. I wouldn't do it here necessarily. And the other thing that disturbs me about MBL's position is that this b-pawn is very tender. So you can't play the typical maneuver knight e4, knight c5. Maybe you can compromise and put the knight on c4. But yet again, I think not only has Magnus solved his opening problems, I think Maxime is the one who has to struggle to keep the balance. Knight d5 here is a simple move, and that forces the bishop back.
Yeah, your move knight c4
I guess it doesn't.
Wasn't appealing because it closed the c-file, but instead he goes knight to e4. If knight takes c3, give me your bishop. After rook takes c3, the c-file remains open. The knight is going to c5. In all likelihood, black is going to have to part with his dark square bishop as well. But as you're highlighting here, that black strikes in the center with it goes queen f7, going after the b3 pawn. Still a decent position for black, even if not the optimal move. But the point is, once white tries for knight c5, b3 is loose, and also that frees up the e4 square, so black can play e5 to e4 if that knight were not blockading the pawn.
And if you try to defend the pawn with knight f to d2, you're allowing the knight to jump into d4 with rather devastating effect. And even if you don't end up losing e2, what you might allow black to do is push the pawn up to c6 and take the sting out of white's bishop. MBL sacrificing the pawn. Is he intending rook c5 to b5 here? Is he still flirting with an exchange sacrifice? Robert, the eval bar seems to approve of his play, but what is the follow-up?
I think rook b5 looks pretty decent because if you play knight to d2, attacking the bishop and going after knight c6, exactly, the very safe and sound bishop d5 retreat, there are no problems there for black. So knight d2 doesn't work, which leaves rook b5 as the alternative. And after rook b5, well, the bishop on b3 is actually not threatened. So maybe black has enough time to defend b7 with rook to b8, as you're highlighting here. But that does look a little bit odd. So you have to be very careful here if you're Magnus Carlsen.
Absolutely, and queen b2 is in the same spirit. It does give black a tempo, which you can use to push the pawn up to a4. But then the conversation about knight d2 has to be reopened because the bishop on b3 is immobilized as long as b7 remains undefended. Of course, our old friend knight c6 to d4, white always has to reckon with that move whenever he moves the knight away from f3, bishop d5, by Magnus using tactics, Robert, to protect the b7 pawn.
And there's an argument to be made for a move like queen takes b7, knight d4, rook takes d5, and exchange sacrifice, because once you win b7, c7 will fall next. I don't know if I would go for that here. The move e2 to e4, kicking the bishop back, and then queen takes b7, because then your knight is loose, and there's no pressure of the bishop against the queen on b7. So e4 looks like a worthy move. However, the downside is the d3 pawn becomes a permanent target, and maybe you'll get c7, but you'll lose d3. The bishop on g2, as you were just highlighting, doesn't look so great. It's a really big choice. Both options look quite promising.
But you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. I think MBL should decide on e4. Look at the clock, though. He's down to 25 seconds. One would think that Magnus is normally the one down by a minute in these types of positions, but he's turned it around in the first game of the 3-minute portion. Rook to b5, a move we thought might have been played earlier. He plays it now. He's trying to induce b6, which Magnus is not going to play because then there are tactics. The rook takes d5 and the knight was loose. Speaking of the knight, it moves back and undevelops itself in order to protect b7.
That's one of the moves that you say when you're just glossing over the game. You don't really give that its full credit. Knight b8 is a phenomenal move. You save your pawn on c7 and your b pawn, and now the knight can jump out. Knight a6 to c5 at some point. Watch out still for ideas revolving around rook takes d5, sacrifice. The light squares are compromised. But look at Maxim's clock and look at Magnus's. Magnus, as you were just saying, up a lot of time here. He can figure things out. Maybe king h8 could be a prudent move at some point. I just don't think it's necessary right now.
And it's a Magnus-style move. I think MVL's only obvious queenside idea is to push that pawn up to a5, keep breaking apart Black's queenside, keep inducing weaknesses. Love the speed with which MVL played a4, and the clock situation is starting to balance out here.
Yeah, a bit. And knight c5, a5, knight b3. There might be an exchange sec on b3 or on d5 right away. So you have to be really careful about these knight jumps. And the knight on a6, it really wants to improve. Knight to c5, but with a5 on the docket, I'm not so sure it works out.
So maybe move the bishop away from d5, but as you said, a5 comes really fast. Magnus counter-strikes in the center with e4. Now the d-file is open, and White's rook on b5 is kind of out of commission. Who is going to prevail? And Magnus accelerating the pace of his play. Knight a4.
Watch out for the fork. He goes rook to b4, and now the bishop can move out the way, and e2 is a target.
Oh. And it's just a problem that you can never really take on b6 because of that fork. MVL trying to simplify, but it looks
like rook b6.
White is
rook b6.
And rook takes d6.
Exactly, but he's just going and saying my pawn structure is healthier, and that is true. So White has an advantage here, a long-term one. Rook c6.
Rook b6, what a move.
Yeah,
counter-attacking Black's queen, he's up a pawn.
Magnus in trouble here. And on the clock, it's about to even up. Where's he going to go?
White can play rook c2 can be played on the next move. White can stabilize pretty easily here. 7 seconds for Magnus.
Rook c2, and opposite, he goes queen b4, rook d4, okay.
You can take it
rook b8.
If you wanted.
Yeah, rook b8 type of stuff, exactly.
All right, now it's a 50-50 game. No risk for MBL. He can keep pushing. He should be able to win this.
Magnus a good defender, but this is not pleasant at all. Knight f5 coming your way right now. Goes king
improves. Up. Maybe g6 should be considered. There's that knight.
And Black desperately wants to trade knights. So the knights come off. The drawing task is not easy, but easier. But with the knight on h4 and the knight rerouting itself at some point, look at the trades happening.
I think Magnus is making progress.
He certainly is. He doesn't want to play g5, though, because that allows the knight to go into the f5. Ooh.
Say that again. Come again. Something happened with my headphones there.
Well, rook he got to trade the
trying
rooks.
To force
That's
the rook
why.
Trade. It's still not totally over, but I think it's a draw. I think at this point it should be pretty easy.
Yeah, because you can't create a pass pawn.
Dude, that was crazy. Was it ever even in doubt? It's almost like he was never worse to begin with. But he allowed a pawn endgame. It's still a draw, though.
I think he's lucky, because I don't think he saw the
He missed it. Oh, he definitely missed it. King g7, I think, is the move, but will he find it with 1 second?
Okay, and now king f7, king d4, king e6.
We've seen players lose.
And he has opposition.
He does, but where does he go now? Back to
Great
d6,
move.
So he can meet king f4 with king e6. Magnus just in command of these endgame principles to a T.